Napoleon Bonaparte. Where do you start with a subject like that? Because Napoleon is just a massive figure in history, and as a result, you will find a wide range of opinions on Napoleon. Many will say that he wiped out an entire generation of young men in Europe. Others will say that most of these wars were declared on France and that Napoleon was simply responding to these threats. Some will say Napoleon was a warmonger, while others will say that is ridiculous, that Europe had been at war many times before the time of Napoleon. So he is one of the more controversial figures in history. I will say this, though, that some of the more recent analysis tends to portray him in a much more favorable light. So let's talk briefly about the entire series, as this is the introductory video. First, this will not just contain material about Napoleon. We will examine many important events during Napoleon's time, specifically the events surrounding the French Revolution, which played a huge role in Napoleon's rise. We will also start out with Napoleon's youth and work our way through all of his major campaigns right up until his final loss at Waterloo, which of course led to his exile on St. Helena. We will also examine his pivotal role in putting together the Grand Army, one of the greatest fighting forces ever assembled. In this introductory video, we will review some aspects about Napoleon's character, and then in the next video, we will start out with the timeline portion of this series and examine Napoleon's beginnings, which of course starts out not in France, but in a small town on Corsica. Now, before we move to the next slide, let's talk about Napoleon as an icon, because he is of course a major icon in world history. And is there any image really more recognizable than Napoleon, dressed up in his military uniform with his oversized hat? Most probably not. Napoleon also has been the subject of literally countless books. Author Andrew Roberts stated in his book that there have been more books written about Napoleon than the total amount of days since his death. That's a lot of books and a lot of days. Like all great generals, Napoleon had the ability to inspire the soldiers and officers under him. I remember watching an interview of a World War II veteran, and at one point he stated he fought under Patton. Now that struck me as interesting, since he didn't mention he fought for the U.S. Army or list his division or regiment. He said he fought for Patton. And this certainly would have been the case for Napoleon's soldiers. They fought more for Napoleon than they did for France. Part of this was a result of Napoleon's great determination. He was absolutely determined to have the finest army in Europe, and of course he achieved that. Napoleon could not only inspire the armies under him, but also the general public. The French tossed out their kings and queens during the French Revolution, but just a few years later they were willing to set that aside and watch Napoleon crown himself not a king, but an emperor. And that was made possible since Napoleon was riding on a tidal wave of popularity in France. So it was Napoleon's ability to inspire people that stands out in terms of his character. He inspired tremendous nationalism, and this again led to his enormous popularity in France. But also, Napoleon's actions in turn inspired fierce nationalism in the countries that opposed him. As we know, Napoleon achieved a staggering amount of success on the battlefield, and this was due in no small part to his absolute mastery of details. He had an eye for detail that blows my mind. I remember James Cameron, the famous movie director, was once asked how he mastered his expertise, which of course is directing movies. And he said that early on he rented a movie camera, and he reverse engineered the movie camera. He actually took the entire camera apart and then put it back together. And he said that's how he learned every detail about how to make movies. And Napoleon was the same way. He knew everything there was to know about warfare. He knew about how all the cannons were built. He knew about all of the armaments, all of the ammunition, how every piece of his enormous military machine worked. He also mastered the details of military infrastructure. And so this is one of the things I greatly admire about Napoleon, his attention to detail. Napoleon was in the business of defeating armies, and so he made it his business to learn about every facet of warfare. But even though Napoleon was a master of details, he also had the ability to stand outside of it all and look at the overall picture from a much larger point of view, from a campaign level view. And that's what separates the average general from the great general. Napoleon didn't just exercise his talents on the military, he also tirelessly worked to improve every aspect of the state he ruled. This is best illustrated in the Napoleonic Code, which reformed laws not only in France, but in other parts of the world. Although Napoleon embraced modern technology, he was truly a general living in the past, for it was in the past that Napoleon learned many of his tactics in warfare. Napoleon studied what I like to call the big three in ancient history: Caesar, Alexander, and Hannibal. He studied all of their campaigns and tactics extensively. In particular, Napoleon regarded Hannibal as one of the great strategists. And in some of Napoleon's campaigns, especially Austerlitz, you can see Hannibal's influence. In fact, it's hard not to compare Napoleon and Hannibal. They both inspired the men under them. Both had a famous crossing of the Alps. Both had spectacular victories, and both ended their careers with destructive losses. So again, Napoleon is the great student of military history. So much so that he once said, "I have fought 60 battles in my life. I did not learn anything from any one of them that I did not already know at the beginning." Wow, well, that's quite a statement. But there is a certain accuracy about the statement, since Napoleon studied everything there was to know about military history. I think Napoleon really stands out in terms of his inspired use of artillery and rapid marches. And this was necessary since warfare was changing rapidly in the second half of the 18th century. Army sizes saw dramatic increases. This placed an increasing emphasis on dividing an army into divisions. And with that, there was a need for greater specialization. So we see divisions having very specific purposes, such as divisional artillery. Later, Napoleon divided the French army into larger units called corps. These were essentially several divisions grouped together. Napoleon's great innovation here was that each corps acted as its own independent military group and could essentially fight their own battles if need be. Napoleon also had the option to mass all of his corps together to fight a major engagement or to surround an enemy. Napoleon also mastered the timing down of each corps, such that all of the corps could be in the right place at the right time. This was made possible because of the excellent marshals under Napoleon, marshals that Napoleon had handpicked. And so it was Napoleon's marshals that were able to make his orders a reality. Napoleon's innovation of the corps is felt even in modern armies today. Now, in terms of artillery, cannons during Napoleon's time were becoming increasingly lighter and much more mobile. The accuracy and firepower also increased. With these technological advances, artillery was responsible for a majority of combat deaths in the Napoleonic Wars, and we will see that throughout the 19th century. Artillery was a massive killer. Now, in terms of artillery, Napoleon greatly utilized the light cannon to achieve victory in battle. It also allowed his armies to move fast, and this is where Napoleon really excelled, mobilizing and moving his army before the other army could gain position. Many times he was confronted by large coalitions that could destroy him, and so he often sought to defeat one army before all of the other armies allied against him could link up. So movement and speed were critical, and often the speed at which Napoleon's armies moved stunned his enemies. His inspired marches and speed also could disrupt an enemy line of communication and even outflank opponents. Movement and timing, so critical to Napoleon's strategy. We will discuss all of this in Napoleon's campaigns. Now, much has been made of Napoleon's height or lack thereof, and this is greatly misunderstood. Napoleon, of course, during his own time had many enemies, and so the propaganda of the day depicted Napoleon as shorter than average. Modern historians tend to dismiss this, and his actual height was believed to have been around 5'6". And that actually was the average height during Napoleon's time. But the idea of a short Napoleon has survived, and so we hear terms such as Napoleon complex to describe smaller, overly aggressive people. Okay, so in the next video we will cover Napoleon's early years.